Morning, Daniel.
Nope, I'm back.
Isn't it supposed to be Daniel's week?
Yeah, but I owe him for covering while I was overseas.
Fair enough. So, what would you like to discuss today?
The cost of travel and special considerations, children with disabilities and how that could impact financial planning for families, and downsizing your life.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, you just went on a big trip, so I guess travel makes a lot of sense. Children with disabilities, I'm not sure where that one's coming from, but we can certainly chat about it. And downsizing your life is a fun conversation. So, we'll start with some interesting stuff, move to some sad stuff, and then jump around to some happy stuff, hopefully.
We gotta end on a high note.
Downsizing, the highest of notes.
It could be. We'll see. We'll see.
My inner minimalist will be pleased.
Yes, but first we have to talk about travel, my favorite thing.
Okay. Are you just going to tell us about your trip to Slovenia and Croatia, or do you have actual questions?
Well, later I think I'm going to make you look at all 5,000 photos that we took. But before that, I thought we would talk about rental car insurance to start. I did mess up my rental car on the trip. Obviously, that's where this topic is coming from. So that kind of leads me to be like, okay, I think we should talk about for everyone all these little travel things that they should think about that can incur a big cost. We've talked about insurance and things on this podcast before in a more generic way, and health insurance and things like that. But there's little types of insurance, like when you're renting a car. It's very expensive. Do I need to pay for it? It's really tempting not to. There's things to do with credit cards. Do you have any input there on that? I'm sure you do.
Sure. Yeah, a couple of really obvious, sort of important things. First and foremost, when renting a car domestically or internationally, you should generally use a credit card for a couple of reasons. One is going to be that, particularly overseas, not so much domestically, but really quite a bit overseas, you'll have these very large cash holds placed in your account that you may not be able to afford with a debit. So, to give you some example, like when I went to New Zealand for my honeymoon, we rented a car. There was like a $5,000 cash hold placed in our car, or our card, excuse me. And so in that context, you run into an issue where for a lot of people, you're traveling on a budget or you just don't keep a lot of cash on hand for any variety of reasons. You can end up with a really big outlay on debit cards in the first place. So just in general, credit cards are going to be beneficial for that reason because you don't actually have to spend the money, quote unquote, or have the money locked up. You're just losing some of your available credit. But more importantly, there are a lot of credit cards that have a robust set of travel benefits. Some cards are specifically built for travel purposes. You don't necessarily need to have one for that, but often it's going to come with a, hey, if you book your car and do your reservation on your car through our particular credit card, you will have some damage, benefits. For example, I have a colleague who actually rented a car here in Denver last year and got like a windshield crack while he was driving around, and his American Express ended up paying for it instead of having to pay for the car insurance. Now, I want to forward a point of caution here, though. There's often quite a bit of terms and conditions-iness around the credit card insurance on things like rental cars. So just being mindful that it's not just a magic blanket that'll protect you from all liability. It's really just sort of there to protect you, the car itself, to some kind of minor extent, and not like a very expensive luxury car. Like if you're renting a Camry, you're probably okay. But if you decide to go all the way up the spectrum and rent a car that costs like $200 a day, or you're taking maybe a Turo from a private vendor instead of a rental car company, you may find in the terms and conditions that you're not very well covered by that credit card benefit.
Right. That's part of what we ran into because our credit card that we put it on had some coverage, but not what felt adequate to me. So I did purchase like some additional insurance through the car rental place. I went through Enterprise, and that turned out to be an excellent idea because I did scratch the back of it. So that's my big tip to everybody. Read the credit card terms and conditions of your insurance and then buy the supplemental whatever if you need to. I think the only thing that wasn't covered at all was like the lights on the car. There was no way to cover that, but we didn't damage the lights. So
Yeah, I'll say, buying the car rental places insurance is probably going to be your best form of insurance, cost benefit wise. The only point of concern or consideration I have there is I think you have to make a very fair evaluation of the risk level. So, for example, when I rented a very large van for transporting my bachelor party and wedding party group around like the San Francisco Bay Area, I've never really driven a big van type car, so I went ahead and got the insurance company's insurance or the rental company's insurance because I was like, you know what, this is a big honking vehicle that I don't normally drive. That's a risk, right? I'm used to driving a nice small SUV or sedan type vehicle, and so I'm going to account for my lack of experience with this as part of the risk considerations. If I was going to rent in a place like New York City and I was going to be driving around Manhattan, I would absolutely get the extra insurance because driving there is chaos and crazy. So it just becomes a risk assessment decision. I think particularly overseas, it makes a lot more sense, even though, as you point out, it can be very expensive. So just being mindful of, the familiarity of the environment, the types of driving, the culture of driving, your familiarity with the vehicle all makes sense. The other part here is that your personal auto insurance can apply to rental vehicles, but often you need to pay for an additional rider to really get the full wraparound benefits of your normal auto insurance on a different vehicle. So just keeping in mind that some people say like, well, I have auto insurance, I'm good. But if you read your terms and conditions, a lot of carriers will make you pay a little bit extra, something like $20 every 6 months to have your normal auto policy wrap around a rented vehicle or a third party vehicle as well.
Right. I, yeah. I always like to go through the rental car company if I can, also just for the convenience factor, I guess. It's a little bit more of a pain to go other routes. For me personally, I will pay extra for that because, I brought the car back and I was like, they said, how was your experience? How was everything? And I said, it is scratched. And they said, great, we don't care. You have the full coverage. Have a nice day. Give me the keys. Like, there was no fuss. There was no hassle. Get on the plane. And I'm also willing to pay a little bit just for that experience.
And I think that is, paying for convenience, paying for risk management. I think that's an excellent use case for that type of consideration.
Right. So then my other thought here, in addition to this, I did get a parking violation also in my rental car. Listen, there's no signs over there. The roads are very narrow. We were in Slovenia and Croatia for reference. Those cities were built so long ago, they were built for pedestrians, not cars. There's nowhere to park. But anyway, I got a parking ticket. And one other point of caution, deal with it at the time. We took the time to try and translate the ticket into English so we could understand it and found out that if you do not pay it within 3 days, it goes from a €15 fine to a €600 fine. And there was that moment of temptation, like, okay, we'll just throw this in the glove box and we'll ask the rental car company when we bring it back. Well, that would have been too late, and we would have to pay 600 instead of 15. So, point of caution: translate your tickets. Also, save yourself some money and pay immediately.
Yeah, pay immediately, sort of in general. I will point out also the other item of caution around this, just in general, is that like you don't know how stringent other countries' laws are. Like in the United States, driving is just sort of this like rite of passage thing we do to teenagers, and then we're kind of very relaxed about it nationally. Other countries can take driving stuff way more seriously, right? Like in the United States, you can get multiple DUIs, multiple traffic tickets, multiple parking tickets, etc., and like still be driving. But in a lot of countries, it's very much like an FAFO issue. If you are reckless or don't take care of things very responsibly, you can find yourself either in jail or with severe restrictions on your ability to travel. So I think it is something to be really mindful of. I'll throw out there, and I don't know about like your particular itinerary and where you're going exactly and so on. I am a big fan of just public transit in places like Europe where public transit seems to be pretty strong. That may have not been the case in the area that you were in, but that's also just something to consider. In the US, we have terrible public transit, generally speaking, but overseas, particularly in westernized countries or kind of more advanced countries, there tends to be pretty good infrastructure for just taking the bus or taking the train instead of taking the hazards of renting a car, dealing with parking tickets, insurance, all of that.
Oh, absolutely. We rented a car. We were in a lot of rural villages up in northern Slovenia, so we needed it. And then when we got down into southern Croatia with a little bit better public transport, we returned the car a little bit early before the end of trip. But still didn't avoid that one parking ticket.
I feel like you were trying to get kidnapped or something by going to tiny rural villages, but maybe that's just my paranoid American, thing going on there.
That's how I always travel. I picked safer countries this time. You would be excited for me. I Actually, most people in my life were excited I picked these countries. Very low crime rates, actually, as far as just like petty crimes and things there.
Oh, that's a plus. I know, pickpockets are sort of making the waves or making the news at the moment in Europe. So I'm glad you avoided that issue outside of your scratching your car and your parking ticket.
Yes, and one questionable experience in a lift that I don't think was actually a lift, but again, totally fine and not a financial issue.
Again, back to trying to get kidnapped.
Well, I got it. It was the right car. And then it wasn't a lady, it was some guy. And I was like, "You're not Teresa." And he goes, "No, Teresa's my mom. I got banned from Lyft, so I use her account." And I was like, "Let me out of this car. What do you mean? You can't do that."
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, you can't do that, but also just like immediate question: why did you get banned from Lyft?
Oh, I asked him that, and he goes, "Well, it's not fair." He says they do this face verification several times per day, and I failed it because I used to have a beard and now I don't have a beard, and so they locked my account for 5 days. And I was like, I don't actually know if Lyft does that to drivers. They didn't used to. I don't know if they do face verification or he was just making that up, but didn't feel good about that. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm gonna put that in the risks not needed to be taken category.
Yeah, well, you got to get out of the car. I was traveling with my sister, and I was like, "Get out of the car right now. Get out. You're done."
Fair enough. Well, other than rental car problems and scratching your car and parking tickets, anything else in the travel genre we want to talk about?
Definitely check, your phone plan and roaming charges and things like that. We went the route of just getting an eSIM for her phone because we were together the whole time. It's like, well, I don't need to. It's fine. But, in the process of calling our various providers and things like that, you can really rack up some fees if you do not alert your carrier that you're traveling. I would look out for that.
It's interesting. Like obviously eSIMs, like if you particularly trip or it's just going to be very expensive on your network fees, whatever, I think it's a good idea to go that route. I will say I appreciate that it's sort of automagic these days. I remember the last time I spent significant time overseas prior to honeymoon and wedding and all of that. I was like in Europe for a couple of weeks, and it was back in the day when like you had to essentially buy a special cell phone to get on a different network. It was just this whole hassle that went into it. So I appreciate it now that essentially your phone works anywhere in the world. It'll just cost you more money. But obviously, to your point, right? If it's going to be for a long time or the daily rate's going to be outrageous, it does just make sense to get an eSIM or maybe even just buy a burner phone locally and just go ahead and pick one up at a Target or something or the ye old Target, whatever the equivalent is, wherever you are, and just use a local phone for a couple of days or a week or two. But your mileage may vary.
All right. I'm a big fan of just mooching off people's free Wi-Fi. I leave my phone on airplane mode the entire time I've gone. If anyone back home needs something, that's just too bad. But most places you stay and restaurants and whatever, they have Wi-Fi. You can connect. WhatsApp. I don't know.
Need and want are very different things in that regard.
I love being unreachable. I'm not paying extra to be reached, but that's a personal thing.
Fair. I have a hard time disconnecting, so I can appreciate enthusiasm for separation.
Listen, if I'm on the summit of an Alp and I get an email, I'm mad. I'm mad about it.
Very fair. Very fair.
Okay, also, we can't forget this. Using your cards and ATM fees and things like that. That was a huge thing. All of the ATMs there and a lot of other countries, when you put our card in to withdraw, I was fully aware of like what my fees were in transactions and international rates, all this before we go. And the ATM always asks you, do you want to convert this to USD for an extra 7.3%? Like, no, that's a terrible deal. And you can just hit no, and then it's like, oh, okay, sorry. And then it doesn't charge you the 7.3%. I don't know who's picking yes on that option on the screen, but you can just say no. So also, what's going on with that?
Yeah, currency conversions is quite an interesting area because to some extent, the sort of bear market rate for that tends to be somewhere in the 1% range, whether you're going through a bank, a specialty exchange, et cetera. The places at the airport tend to be the worst just because they are sort of there and they kind of have you hostage or they have you hostage if you haven't done your homework. That said, I mean, the vast majority of places these days have digital payment options. So to some extent, the need to carry around, literal local currency seems to have declined quite dramatically over the years. Not to say you won't just, end up in a place without internet connection or, have a taxi driver who requires cash instead of a digital payment. But, there's this weird American thing where we sort of think of a lot of the world as being kind of just the third world in this like very poor, unadvanced sense. But like they have smartphones in Africa, they have smartphones in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, et cetera, et cetera. It's not like they're just living in caves. And so to that extent, I mean, I almost would take the disposition that you don't need cash to begin with and go get cash on an as needed basis rather than, pulling out $200-300 before your trip just in case, only to find out that you got scalped 10% going in, 10% coming back, and never spent a dime in hard currency.
Right. We went to ATMs when we encountered people who said cash only. A couple of places we stayed were cash only because, again, we used questionable resources to find rooms to stay. But, otherwise we're not carrying cash because, yeah, it can be really expensive and unnecessary.
Well, not to mention just again like the pickpocket risk that goes with it. I mean, this is sort of the whole basis behind like travelers checks back in the day, which I think you can still get them, but obviously they're just a huge pain in the butt. But I mean, that same basic premise of like trying to keep your money secure, right? Physical currency is going to be stealable or misplaceable or losable. Your digital, your credit card can get stolen, and somebody can try to rack up some charges. But at the end of the day, all you have to do is be able to just turn around and cancel it and do a reissue or something like that, and your money is safe. And particularly with credit cards versus debit cards, they'll just credit it back to you pretty much instantly as a fraudulent transaction.
Yeah, pretty painless compared to losing your wad of cash.
Yeah, yeah, for the most part. But again, some people say cash is king. I think those people are crazy, but to each their own.
I mean, whatever works for you, I guess. But yeah, I'm not a big fan myself either.
Yep. Yep. All right. Anything else in the travel genre, or shall we move on to the great and exciting topic of disabled children?
Oh, we can move on to the disabled children. I feel good.
Okay. Well, then, what in this wide genre of life and love and joy and tragedy, what would you like to discuss?
Well, first of all, I think when talking about this topic, it's important that people have a little bit of context on the difference between guardianship and conservatorship is a big thing that's kind of come up as I've talked to people about this and read about it. So I don't know if you have a succinct summary there, you want me to go into it, but they're not the same by any means.
I mean, guardianship is sort of something I think most people are going to be familiar with in the spirit of you have a child, a minor, or somebody like that, and you are serving as their caretaker in a general sense, right? You're their parent, you're their aunt, uncle, godparent, whatever circumstance has placed this child or this minor in your care. That's going to be your primary area of responsibility. You are, kind of a parent or guardian phrase is something you see on all the school permission forms the whole time you're growing up, and that's not really any different here. Conservatorship is going to be something that is put in place by the court for the benefit of somebody, whether that be a child or an adult, and is essentially in varying degrees removing legal rights from them and placing them in the hands of a fiduciary third party, which could be still a parent, still a family member, or it can be a third party like a law firm or a trustee company. So in those particular cases, you're thinking about people with kind of severe cognitive or physical disabilities who, through no fault of their own, generally speaking, just cannot be allowed to or relied upon to manage their own affairs without the risk of either misplacing, misappropriating things, or otherwise being taken advantage of.
Right. Okay, so we've got that clear. What about setting up or having then an ABLE account? Because that's something we get a lot of questions around when it comes to planning about this.
So specifically, what we're talking about here is 529 ABLE, which ABLE is an acronym, Achieving a Better Life Experience is what it stands for. These came around in 2015, and these were designed as sort of a stopgap between leaving money to your kids directly, giving money to your kids directly, which if they are disabled can have adverse effects on their state or federal benefits, and the full extreme other end, which is special needs trusts, which are established to shelter assets from gifting or estate issues that once again could affect negatively state or federal benefits. Because essentially, if you are on many state or federal disability programs, you're not allowed to have very much money, not allowed to have very much income. And if you exceed the amount of money you're allowed to directly own or the amount of income you're allowed to have, you can see your benefits be reduced or otherwise stopped entirely. So it becomes very challenging and problematic for people with disabilities, even self-sufficient adults who maybe are not in a guardianship, conservatorship situation, but just adults who have a physical disability or impediment, not necessarily a cognitive one. In a lot of those cases, if they suddenly have a parent pass away or somebody leaves them money or they get a job that pays too much, they can lose their state benefits or their federal benefits for a time or indefinitely if they're not able to kind of get rid of those sources of income. So 529 ABLE exists as a less than trust, less than lawyer version of a savings account for people with disabilities and allows you to put money in up to a certain limit and allows that the person with the disability ability to be able to access money without negatively impacting their state benefits.
And can they use the money in those accounts for anything?
Loosely. There's sort of an interesting distinction here where it's kind of supposed to be for the general welfare, not so much for cost of living things. There's some weird definitional things where things like, going out to eat would be fine, or buying them a gift would be fine. You want to have an Xbox, let's say. Like those sorts of things are fine, but the rules are a little bit squiffy around things like paying for rent or paying for day-to-day care, groceries, medical expenses, etc. It's something where you kind of have to look at the specific thing you're trying to pay for and go review the rules to ascertain whether a thing is going to be permitted or not. Because if you misuse the funds, then you can once again find that it becomes treated as an asset of the person with a disability and affects their state benefits.
Is there a way to, repay the account and kind of undo that, or that's a pretty permanent thing if you misunderstand the rules?
It's not so much about the repayment. It's not like a mulligan thing where it's like, oops, we took out money for the wrong reason. Let's just put that back and we're good. It's that a lot of the state mechanisms that are in place to prevent, misuse or abuse of the system, i.e., the making too much money, having too much money thing, can automatically be triggered by a transfer. Let's say somebody says, I want to take a vacation with my able money, and you say, great, we'll send you the money to do that, and then suddenly the money's in the bank account and it triggers an alert, and the state will just suddenly freeze their benefits until their balance gets below that level. So then it's not so much about putting the money back so much as getting the money out, gone, spent somehow, getting below the level, and then going to the state and recertifying.
So there could be a period of time then while you're making all these adjustments where you're without benefits.
And timing can be a real pain here too, because let's say your benefits are being paid out on the first of each month, and on the second of the month you had this transfer, and you're ineligible, right? But you don't, immediately know that, and maybe they send you a paper letter somewhere, but you don't check your mail that frequently, or you miss it, or it gets lost, and then you get around to the first of the next month, and suddenly your benefits don't show up. And suddenly you're missing your rent payment, or your subscriptions aren't getting paid for, or your utilities aren't getting paid for. And then you have to go through this process of recertifying, which state by state can be easier or more difficult. This is one of those things, not to get into politics too much, but there are many states that try to make public social benefits very difficult to obtain and very difficult to maintain, because they have sort of this focus on self independence versus support of the state. Some states are very generous in this area. So then, depending on kind of whether you live in a red area or a blue area, your mileage may vary based on how easy it is to lose your benefits and how easy it is to reobtain or recertify, or how difficult it can be.
Yeah, I guess it's something to definitely pay attention to, because that can make quite a mess for you and your loved ones. That's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I deal with this in my family. I have a nephew with some fairly severe physical and cognitive impairments, who has been essentially on state benefits essentially since he was born, and will probably stay on state benefits in his entire life. And so a great deal of my extended family's estate planning and gift planning and all of that has revolved around his specific needs and avoiding accidentally invalidating his benefits at some point in the future.
Right. So, okay, in an instance like that where you're doing estate planning and everything's been thought of, is a will enough, or are there a lot of other things that need to be put in place when there's somebody like that in the family?
A will could be enough, but only insofar as you are essentially going to leave that special needs individual on their own. So, let's say you have two children, one is special needs, one is not special needs. Technically, if you just leave everything to the non-special needs child, you could potentially forego or bypass any of these potential issues. The obvious problem and consideration here being, maybe you don't want to just financially abandon your special needs child and leave them on their own and say, sorry, your sibling gets everything because you have an impairment or an impediment of some sort. So functionally, you're almost always going to need some version of special needs trust planning, preferably really far in advance, to account for this, where essentially anything you want to leave to the special needs individual goes into that trust instead of going to the individual. And from that, then, it doesn't affect their benefits. Now, often the kind of long run of how does this work, why does this work this way, is that often a lot of these things will then, when the special needs individual passes away, a lot of states and a lot of these will be structured in a way that then the state functionally absorbs it, or a charity functionally absorbs whatever the leftovers are, or the state can reimburse itself otherwise for the costs it incurred for the special needs individual after they've passed on.
So the money in the fund is not going to go back to a sibling or whoever maybe is taking care of them and helping them.
I'm sure there's some creative mechanisms and ways that you could try to effectuate that, but generally what I see in this area is a charity or the government is going to end up being sort of the final beneficiary of this stuff because it's sort of a handshake agreement. It's saying like, hey, we're not just going to scalp your estate for every penny it's worth because we don't want your special needs child to get something. You can leave money to them if you do it in the right way, but we've now been paying for or supporting them for years, decades, whatever it is. And now that they've passed on, and now that sort of the family interest in this individual and their welfare has passed, the public has been paying their way for a long time. We're going to try to reimburse ourselves to some extent.
Sure. Okay, well, I suppose as part of setting all of these things up, then just having conversations among family members is also equally as important. Talking about, who does supporting this individual in the family look like maybe they're coming to live with me, or are we just giving them financial support? How do you have a conversation like that?
I mean, this is going to be very dependent on the needs of the individual. And frankly, this sort of gets into even just like the long-term care conversation, right? We talk to a lot of people who are getting up there in years. We say, "What's your long-term care plan?" And they go, I don't have one. I'll just jump off a cliff." And then you're like, "Okay, I've literally never seen somebody do that." Like a lot of people make that joke, but let's be serious about this. Assuming you don't do that, what are you going to do? And they kind of shrug and go, "Well, I guess we'll just move in with our kids," right? And you see the same thing with special needs children. It's like, well, who's going to take care of child with disabilities or even adult with disabilities one day? Oh, well, their siblings will. Okay, are the siblings part of that conversation? Are they willing and able? Do they desire to sort of? This is an uncharitable way of framing it, so I apologize for anybody who feels differently about this. But are you going to burden them with this responsibility? And some people gladly do it, and some people don't. And that's something that has to be contemplated here is, there's a lot of challenging family dynamics about quality of life, costs, responsibility, because functionally, depending on the needs of this individual, it might be very nominal. Maybe they just need a little bit of help and they'll be okay in a group living situation. Some people need full 24/7 care. And that can be a really substantial burden, not just financially, but mentally, emotionally, right? And can have some pretty severe ramifications for people who accept or have the burden placed upon them. So it's something where it's not so much just like there's phases to it. We'll just kind of approach it this way or that way. Every person with a disability is a unique individual with unique needs that need to be addressed accordingly.
Right. Yeah, I had a close friend years ago who had a few children, one of which had disabilities that required both cognitive and physical support. She was very dependent on her mother. And then her mother, my friend, passed away in a house fire very suddenly overnight. And the agreement had always been, okay, her siblings will take care of this child. She needs help, like we'll step in. But then when there was this sudden death, the sibling who was supposed to, in theory, take care of everything had just accepted a job in Dubai and was moving. And she's like, well, wait a minute. I always thought this would be years down the road. I'd be back in the States by then, blah, blah, blah. And the plan kind of fell apart through nobody's fault. And they gathered together and they figured it out. They took really good care of her, but they didn't really have a contingency plan in place beyond, okay, she'll take care of her one day. And then she couldn't because events surprised them. Of course, they weren't planning on that happening.
Oh, that's sort of the whole thing of delaying your estate plan, delaying your will, delaying your life insurance, all of that. Like none of us are going to die anytime soon, and then suddenly we do. And whether it was planned for or not is sort of the open question there. Also, just sort of the other devastating thing about this, right? Sometimes you can spend years or decades doing this really complex planning for the needs of this individual, and then they pass away. And then suddenly you've done a ton of work and it's all for naught. Not to say it wasn't doing right. Proper preparation prevents poor performance, but it is that element where it's challenging on everybody. Special needs planning is a really emotionally challenging area. It's a really financially challenging area. It's a very dominating part of anybody's life to deal with it.
Yeah, it certainly is. Well, I don't know. I guess those are the big questions I had. Do you have any follow-up thoughts, or should we move on to maybe a more uplifting topic?
I think the only thing out here that you didn't bring up is back to sort of the whole like let's just give it all to child A and they'll take care of child B. Be really, really, really careful, and this extends even beyond special needs children. Be very careful about giving assets to somebody on the condition or premise that they're going to take care of somebody else. Because unless there is a trustee relationship, fiduciary relationship, i.e., you put money into a trust and then make somebody a trustee over that trust for the benefit of that third party, there is no legal obligation or financial obligation. So if I leave everything to child A and assume they'll take care of child B, Maybe child A is a bit of a sociopath or just doesn't want to deal with it, and they just abandon child B when you're gone. You're not going to be there to change what your instructions were. So just be very careful about whether it's minor children, people with disabilities, even in a blended family situation where there's children from a prior marriage and you're kind of worried about your spouse and whether they're going to, treat them fairly if you pass away first and so on. Right, leaving things directly to the beneficiary or leaving things to trusts or certain mechanisms to ensure their upkeep, welfare, etc., are attended to is very important. You do not want to just leave money to third parties directly and say, hey, wink and a handshake, you're going to take care of them, right? And they go, absolutely, because they don't have any obligation to beyond their moral or ethical compass to do so.
All right. You always want to imagine that your loved ones are going to do what you want them to, but that does not always happen.
I would even go so far as to say it might be the exception, not the rule, but your mileage may vary.
Very true. All right. Well, okay. Let's switch to something maybe more uplifting. Downsizing your life. That's exciting to you, right?
I am a minimalist, so I love that. Let's get rid of everything. Let's do it.
Okay. So let's talk about the big thing. Oftentimes when people come in and they're talking about downsizing, whether they've retired or, kids are out of the house, empty nesters, whatever, downsizing, people think of the house. I'm living in a big house. I don't need it. I'm moving to a smaller house. What are things that they need to consider when they're making that decision, though? It's not always that simple.
I think there's a big separation between just like your decision to downsize, let's say your home, and your decision to downsize your other assets. So there is a endemic problem, and I think it's only going to get bigger and bigger as time goes on, of people who are trying to downsize, moving from their 4-bed, 3-bath house they raised their family in to a more comfortable 2-bed, 2-bath, or maybe condo, townhome, senior community. All sorts of options are out there. But in the process of doing that, they are making a pretty critical mistake, which is that they are not getting rid of their stuff at the same time. So then what they end up with is either a basement that is just chock full of unusable stuff, or they're ending up with essentially storage units. And then the storage unit's a problem for two reasons. One, it's just full of stuff that we're probably never going to see or use again. But also, let's say mom and dad were paying monthly, and then mom passes away, and then dad passes away, and somebody stops paying monthly. Unless somebody's really on the ball about knowing that exists and staying up on it, you might find 2 months later that a big chunk of the assets in the family or the tangibles that were in storage are suddenly up for auction. So just being really mindful that there are a lot of issues with downsizing beyond just the real estate.
That's certainly something to consider, but it's hard for, I think, a lot of people, maybe not you, but to get rid of their stuff. Do you recommend maybe doing a little bit at a time as you're considering making this choice, or just do one big, huge clean out, rip the Band-Aid off, get rid of a bunch of your stuff?
My number one piece of advice for people for moving, just in general, right, whether we're downsizing, whether relocating, whatever the case is when you've made the intentional decision to start going through that process, is just start filling one box a day, right? People like to do sort of like the spring cleaning, let's just do it all at once thing. It's exhausting. It's a big task. I'm a really big fan of sort of eating the elephant one bite at a time in that regard. I think it's a lot easier to just get one, 2-foot cube box from Home Depot and fill it with books from this one shelf. Not the whole shelf, not even all the shelves, not even all the books, but just we're going to fill one box. That's all we're doing today. And tomorrow when we get home from work or we get back from our volunteering thing or the gym, we're gonna grab another box and get the rest of the books off that shelf. Just little bite at a time activities, I think, are a much more effective way of doing it instead of trying to tell somebody or trying to be somebody who is going through the emotional exhaustion of deciding quote unquote today is the day I decide what stuff I'm going to keep with for the rest of my life and what stuff I'm going to let go of for the rest of my life. My other suggestion in this particular area also, to be really emphatic that it's not meaningful to you that your kids or your family keep stuff when you pass away. The amount of, pardon my French, but just crap people leave behind to their family, and their family really struggle with, like, well, should we keep that camping set? We have memories. We used to go with dad out, fishing. We used to go camping. Should we keep that? Do we need to have a family reunion sometime where we use all of dad's old fishing stuff? If it's meaningful to you, sure, but there's just a lot of stuff that gets left over for no real reason other than that we owned it when we died.
Right. That's pretty true. And then if you haven't made a decision beforehand, you just hang on to it forever and ever and ever and cart it around every time you move. I guess most people do. Maybe not you or I.
That's a big one. The other one also is just certain assets are legal or illegal to own based on kind of grandfathering laws. So the obvious thing I'm thinking of here is firearms. There can be a lot of cases where it was legal for you to own a firearm because you bought it back in 1976 when it was okay to own that type of thing, and then a law passed at some point saying that you can no longer own that type of thing unless you already owned it, and then by law when you pass away or transfer to anybody else, no matter what the situation is, it's no longer legal. So just being mindful also that if you've got that, old super duper modded up kick ass AR-15 somewhere with a bunch of illegal attachments in California, that you may want to dispose of that, defer that, or transfer that however you can legally prior to your passing, rather than leaving a safe full of felonies in your house.
Is there a way to like surrender those without penalty or kind of get rid of them? Maybe you don't know, but
There's a tough answer here, which is pretty much every state has like a limited safe harbor period, 30 days, 90 days, 180 days, where you can sort of hand over illegal stuff. And this is very state dependent. So don't just take my word for it here on the podcast, right? Consult your attorney. But most states have a safe harbor period for inherited items, right? I mean, like here's just a crazy example. Imagine your parents pass away and you're going through their stuff and you just find a kilo of cocaine in the basement. Like, there's a safe harbor here where you can say, "Oh my God, I found a kilo of cocaine. It's not mine, I swear." But just being mindful that again, every state's going to be dependent. I would definitely call a lawyer first before you call the authorities to surrender these things or report these things. But just in that particular context, you can usually deal with it. The trick here is that some people take a really long time to get around to your estate stuff. My parents have a neighbor who their mother passed away, I think like 20 years ago at this point, or close to 20 years ago at this point, and that house is still full of their mother's stuff. There's still an old car parked in the driveway that's been there for 20 plus years. Some people are just very emotionally burdened by dealing with their family's affairs. So that's part of where, on the living side, when it's your stuff, communication is good as much as you can. And again, trying not to leave your family a box or a safe of felonies somewhere in your house is a pretty good idea.
sure. Well, and there's like organizational companies and stuff and estate sale teams that will come in and help you, aren't there? I mean, I've seen signs and stuff for companies that are putting on multiple estate sales for families.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the great resources that are out there. If you ask me, in a perfect world, removing all the emotions and problems from it, the best way you can handle an estate is fly in all the potential heirs and beneficiaries, stick some sticky dots on the things you all want to keep or and then remove those things from the property insofar as it makes sense to do so, and then go ahead and engage one of those estate companies. You can try to garage sale it or do it yourself, but people own a lot more stuff than they should. Be physically exhausting to try to go through everything and try to organize everything and price everything, et cetera. So those companies do, I think, a really good beneficial service. Now they're very expensive relative. You might be giving 20, 30, 40% of the value of the estate to them to do it. But frankly, you're kind of letting them self-source as a moving company to get rid of all this stuff at the end. And that comes at a premium. And frankly, most of the value in your family, parent or your sibling or whoever's estate is probably not going to be in the cardboard boxes in the corner of the basement.
Right. And is it really worth you taking, you know, potentially weeks off work to sort through somebody's old boxes of letters that you're going to throw away anyway? Maybe you should just have a company come in and help you.
Well, and that's something that's important. The family history, the trip down memory lane factor can be heartwarming and heartbreaking, and all sorts of your family may vary. Uh, that is something though where I've seen estate emptying out, the just dealing and processing and getting rid of all the tangibles or organizing who's going to get the tangibles. I've seen that take years. So that's also something where depending on your degree of emotional involvement, even whether you think consciously think like I'm a very stoic, tough person, it's not going to bother me. All you're going to have to do is open up that photo album and see that one picture your whole afternoon. So it's something where, again, looking for the things that are meaningful to you that you really know you want to take with you is important. Having somebody else maybe pull out the pictures, pull out the albums, and say, "Hey, nobody's going to buy these anyway, so this is being put to the side is there." But then just having somebody pick up all the camp chairs, all the old, kite kits, the collection of stained glass shop stuff, whatever it is, I think is very beneficial to just go ahead and let somebody else deal with the bulk of the things.
What if it's something you don't know a lot about? Like my father, for example, owns a farm, and when he passes one day, I don't know anything about auctioning off farm equipment. Like I'm going to have to call in someone who knows what they're doing with that, I assume.
I mean, that's where you just look for an estate sale company that might be able to better fit or tailor its work to the type of business or the type of assets that your family owned, right? Like there's going to be an estate auction company in farm country for farmers that understands the value of this tractor, the value of this barn, and knows who the best agents and realtors are to sell the land and all of that. That's where you're just going to look for a specialist. Whereas if your parents were just like an accountant and a school teacher and they lived in suburbia and they don't own anything more special than a pen collection, you can probably use an estate sale company for most of it. And if you're just maybe aware of the pen collection or the stamp collection or whatever it is, then maybe you go find a specialist for that particular thing. But again, most people's stuff is pretty darn generic when you break it down. Unfortunate, but true.
Very true. All right. Well, okay, so if you're downsizing different things then, what if you have, a fancy car for that you've had and you no longer care for, or a vacation home that you're no longer using? How do we approach downsizing things like that?
I think that one's tough because there might be a lot more emotional involvement in that. I think for the car, depending on the nature of the car, I mean, if it's very fancy, there might be collectors for it, or there might be museums or nonprofits that can accept those and otherwise, put them in their collection or liquidate them, and you can get the charitable benefits of liquidating that old, 67 whatever it is. So I think there's value to those types of kind of organizations. When it comes to something like the vacation home, depending on our timeline here, right? Am I 60 and we haven't been there in 10 years, or am I 90 and we haven't been there in 30 years? My immediate disposition is to look at it as something that could potentially be a rental property or something like that, because for tax reasons, we're likely to get a step up in basis when we pass away. And so if we sell the house or sell the vacation property prematurely, right, recognizing we might be passing away sooner than later, then we might be sticking ourselves with a tax bill that could have been avoided if we just held on to it for 2 more years. Now, there's definitely some property that is more liability than beneficial. This is also where I look at things like the raw single acre in the middle of North Dakota, and I go, there's almost no purpose to that. Maybe it's like your great great grandfather just keeps going down generation by generation by generation by generation. Whatever the situation is, I think there are certain properties where you do just want to look at either trying to get them sold sooner than later just to remove the burden, or if it's going to be left for the estate, for the inheritors, being really honest about like, are we ever going to make use of that land, or is it better to try to sell it to a neighbor or just surrender it to the county and just say, hey, we don't want to pay $17 in property tax for this quarter acre up in the middle of the hills.
Right. Okay. Well, what if you're downsizing and say you're much younger? What about the folks that kind of did the fire method? They saved a ton, they've retired very young, but they're trying to keep their expenses low, and they're like, they don't have all these subscriptions and costs and things like that. They can't necessarily downsize. Do you think at that stage they kind of start to accumulate things, or they remain a minimalist like that? Do you have any, I don't know if I'm wording this correctly for you, but you were already a minimalist at that point. You don't have a lot of stuff. Do you start to accumulate at that point, or just stay as is?
I think you have a false presupposition there. I think there's plenty of people who pursue fire or obtain financial independence who are hobbyists or who are more materialistic or something like that. So I don't think it's a default assumption to say that just because somebody's been aggressively saving or trying to become financially independent means that they will be minimalists by default. Now, if your question is more just what do the minimalists do? I mean, good news, they're already minimalists, problem solved. But some people are more stuff people and some people are not. Again, I'm a bit of a minimalist. My wife is a stuff person. She cannot go to any farmer's market, art market, trip, travel, whatever, without coming back with stuff. And so it's just something where that's something that brings her happiness and joy. It doesn't bring me happiness and joy. I'm not here to yuck her yum. And I think we need to be mindful that it's okay if people accumulate stuff. It's okay if they don't. There's a values judgment being made when we say that people shouldn't accumulate too much stuff or vice versa, and we need to be careful. I think the conversation about downsizing, it obviously makes sense to decumulate stuff when we're downsizing deliberately, but I'm not here to say that somebody should or shouldn't have more or less stuff at any phase of their life, barring hoarder behavior.
Right. Wow. Well, that's a pretty good note, I think, to end on is what is that Marie Kondo thing that she always says? What if it sparks joy, you can keep it or whatever.
And if it doesn't spark joy, throw it into the void.
Yes. You can help people with that portion, and your wife can help people with the sparking joy part.
There we go. And I think that also fits our personalities flawlessly.
Yes, it definitely does.
Okay. Well, I mean, you've been on some big travels the last couple of weeks, so you might have a very robust answer to this or no answer to this at all. But, since the last time you were on the podcast, what do you think you have learned that's meaningful for our audience to take away?
I mean, the one that we've already kind of beat to death is make sure you have good insurance on stuff because I scratched my rental car. But also, I think traveling and being gone the last 2 weeks kind of for me highlighted the importance of budgeting with consideration to your money scripts. I'm somebody who has trouble spending money on certain things. I would rather hoard my money and rewash my Ziploc bags, as we've talked about here before. So it can be hard for me to spend money on like a trip. It was fairly expensive to go for 2 weeks. That was a lot for me. But we saved up in advance, had a budget, knew it was allocated for, and it didn't feel nearly that bad to spend it when it had that purpose and it was earmarked for that the entire time I was earning it, saving it, and then spending it.
Yeah. I mean, a budget can be empowering because, as we like to say, money is permission.
Yeah, money definitely is permission. I mean, we had this bucket earmarked for it. I went on this trip with my sister. That's who I was with. And she had $57 left in her little travel bucket at the end of the trip, just as a specific example. And we got the budgeting pretty close to perfect. And we were psyched about that. And we could kind of travel guilt-free that way.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.